Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Pep Talk, the Persuasive Evangelism podcast from SOLAS. I'm your co-host Simon Wenham, and I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague Steve Osmond. Steve, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. It's been a little while since I've been on the podcast, so I'm just, happy to be back, really.
It's great to have you back. It's actually our first time together, isn't it? Actually, we haven't done one of these before. I've done a number with Gavin Matthews, and for anyone who doesn't know, he's just finished cycling from Land's End to John O'Groat, so that's why he's not here. He's probably lying down somewhere, and if he's not, he probably should be. But moving swiftly on, I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, who is Laura Hancock, Senior Lead for Ministry and Research at Youth for Christ. And we actually used to do youth work together back in the day. We're not even sure how long ago, but it's been quite a while. And she is going to be talking to us about their new Z-A Growing Spirituality report, which was taken from a survey of 11 to 18-year-olds. But before we get into that detail, Laura, I'd just like to say thank you for being on the show. And I wondered if you could just briefly share a little bit about yourself, perhaps where you're based and how you got into evangelism in the first place.
Yeah. Hi, guys. Thanks so much for having me with you. So my name's Laura, as you said. I'm based in Halesowen, which is it's in the Dudley borough. So it's not quite Birmingham. It's not quite Dudley. It's hovering 20 minutes from Birmingham. And I work for British Youth for Christ. I've been here 11 and a half years. Previous to this, I worked as a youth pastor in a church in London. I worked as an outreach worker with quite vulnerable young people. And it has always been on my heart that the church and Jesus is for everyone. And if we believe that Jesus is real and that God is real, then surely that is the most important thing, is other people knowing that too. And so as a teenager, I had some amazing people. I grew up in a church where there was no youth work, but I had some amazing adults invest in me. And I guess felt firsthand of the influence that you can have if you invest in the life of a young person. And then that inspired me to want to pursue that for the next however many years. So yeah, it's great. And I love doing what I do. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, well, thanks again for joining us. And I'm excited for our conversation because I've been reading through this report, and there's just so much encouraging stuff in it. But maybe for those who haven't come across it, or a lot of these reports in the same kind of vein, can you give us just a bit of a brief sense of what the survey is about, very broadly, how it's different from maybe some of the ones that have come out sort of in recent history as well? So yeah, without getting too technical, could you give us just a quick overview?
Yeah, I absolutely love to. We, Youth for Christ, we want to know where unchurched young people are at specifically. So we ask questions of 11 to 18-year-olds who, to the best of our ability, have had little to no church contact. Or if they have, that's because that's the general sample. This piece of research specifically, one of the ways that it's different is that I've now actually been in my job a worryingly long time. And so I first did a piece of research in 2016 with Youth for Christ. And so we've asked, not necessarily always directly comparable, but we've asked the same questions in 2016, in 2020, and in 2025. So some of these questions are interesting because they're asking questions about the spirituality of current young people. But part of the reason it's interesting is because you can actually track the sort of spirituality over the last sort of 9 to 10 years of young people as well. We've asked questions around trust and influence, around spirituality, around the church. And some of the responses, I think, were fairly predictable and what we expected to see. But I think some of the things that came out were surprising, even for us, in a great way, in lots of cases.
Thank you. Well, that leads us nicely on to asking the next question, which is, could you give us a sense of just some of the more exciting findings that have come out during the survey?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So I think one of the things that came out, which was really fascinating, which I think it didn't surprise us, but surprised us to see it written down, was how young people are finding faith at the moment. A lot of the ways that young people are finding faith, a lot of the stories that we're hearing are young people finding faith on their own. So in their bedroom, or they just wander into a church, or stories where young people are taking drugs and just cry out and Jesus answers them. And that is a pattern we noticed. And then what we found fascinating is that when we actually asked questions around who or what has the greatest spiritual influence in your life, family was top at 55%. Now that's been the case like for a long time. Family's always been top. But what's fascinating in the last 5 years, there's been a huge shift in what comes second and third. So it's always been some combination of family, friends, and teachers. But 5 years on, what we've found is that the top second two answers was the church and then myself. So myself was the second top answer. The church was the third. But 5 years previous to that, church was at 1%, myself was at 2%, and now church is at 35% and myself is at 36%. So there's this huge change in young people's self-reliance, and some of that may well be social isolation, spending a lot more time in homes, but that was fascinating. And fascinating for youth workers as well, who are wanting to spiritually influence and invest in young people. I think a fascinating thing for me was young people's perception of the local church, particularly. I think my assumption, if I'm honest, walking into this survey, was that young people were really open to spirituality, but weren't necessarily sure about the church. That's not what we found. We asked young people, like, if you walked into a church, do you think you would feel welcome there? And 70% of young people felt that they would be welcomed at a church. We said, do you see your church in your community, which was a really important differentiation, the church in your community as a positive place, and 65% of young people said yes. Previously, we've asked the same question and only 8% of young people have said that they view it positively. So that, again, is a huge thing. I think the final thing, I know I'm talking a lot, I get excited. The final thing I think that was really exciting was that we were expecting a general increased warmth towards general spirituality. But what we found was specific increase around the person of Jesus. And so in the past 5 years, the number of young people saying that they follow Jesus, that they pray, and that they pray daily have all gone up by 12% in the last 5 years. Now, one of those stats on their own is interesting, but you put those together and that is an interesting pattern. So I think there were some things in there that we were expecting and some things that led you to a real sense of hope and optimism about what God might be doing.
Man, there's so many different things I want to go with. It's so meaty. But I think I would love to sort of pick your brain on some of the main concerns, sort of in young people's lives, the main things that they're thinking about and talking about. So if you could open that up. But before jumping to that, what would you say to someone who would, push back a little bit and say, okay, hey, you've got however many, if I'm not mistaken, around about 1,000 people who did the survey. That's right?
Yeah. That's correct. Yeah.
If someone just said, hey, well, the sample size or sort of the demographic that you use, does this not sway in a certain direction? Could you maybe just give a quick snippet into that sample selection before getting into what are some of those big concerns that the young people have?
Yeah. So 1,000 young people is kind of the appropriate size of a sample for young people in our nation. And we have been really careful about how we source those young people. So we actually went through an external organisation to do that. The reason we did that was because if we went through any of our contacts, they would be Christian contacts, and therefore any young person that they know would have already had Christian influence. So for example, we've got 60 local centres throughout Britain who are all outstanding, and we could have gone through our centres and said, can we survey the young people you work with? But if we'd have done that, then they've already heard about Jesus, they've already been around Christians, and so we didn't want that to be the case. So we wanted this to be as general a representation as could possibly be. The other benefit of that is that they then will filter the findings so that they are to a degree representative. So whether it be in geography or whether it be in sort of ethnic diversity, representative of what is current in our nation. So we quite intentionally used somebody else to gather some of these findings for us, just so that it was as untainted as possible.
So your name wasn't on it, like, hey, this is a youth.
Nope, they had no idea who was asking the questions. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. And as Steve alluded to, actually, there's so much information in there. And one of the things it covers is just the concerns that young people have today. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit about what are the main things that young people are sort of worried about in today's day and age. We might assume things, but obviously it's helpful hearing from them directly. So, yeah, what did it say in that regard?
Yeah, so fairly unsurprisingly, the top answer was around poor mental health. Interestingly, a very close second, that came in at 37%, a very close second at 36% was around bullying and relationships. Following that was image and appearance at 29%. And then after that was negative pressures of social media and social networking at 28% and academic pressure at school at 28%. What I thought was an interesting observation is if you look at the top four, so poor mental health, bullying and relationships, image and appearance, and pressures of social networking, you have to wonder if they're interlinked. And so young people, I mean, one of the questions on here is where young people would choose to connect with other people and spend their time. When we, in the good old days, in 2016, when we originally asked, where would you choose to spend your time? The top answer was outside with friends. You ask that question now, and the top four answers are gaming online, some variation of gaming online, social media, like in a home with friends, like the social connection and the online connection in the last sort of however 60, whatever, how many years, it's grown exponentially. And you have to look at those big issues that young people are facing and go, how many of those are amplified by digital media, the bad use of social media, even relationally and bullying, it all feeds into a mix. So it's an interesting thing where if I wonder you tweaked one of those things, whether some of the other answers that they put in would then begin to resolve themselves slightly.
I'm interrupting this edition of the Pep Talk podcast to tell you that Solas is about to celebrate its 15th birthday, and you're invited to come and join us at 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday the 19th of November online. To access that, go to solas-cpc.org/15. That's the word 15, not the digits. Come and join us as we celebrate 15 years of Solas and look to the future. See you there. And now, back to the podcast.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned those sort of influences. So you mentioned there was social media, the home and friends, and then online gaming as being the place where people would choose to connect with others, especially in this sort of generation. Which to me is, seeing that, I was like, man, that is very in a way unexpected that social media would be the highest. I thought, it'd definitely be in the top, but not the highest. So recently I was on the Isle of Lewis and Harris, and I was asked to speak at to a youth group. And this, at first was, supposed to be a little small, maybe 10 youth, and eventually went up. I think we had more than 110 who arrived on a Sunday evening. So if anyone says, hey, on the island, Christianity is dying out, well, they should just go and have a look for themselves, because it definitely is not. But the point is, while I was just looking at this sort of mass of youth in front of me, I had this realization that, the sort of average age was maybe 14, 15 years old. And I was like, wow, from what I know now, the way they're experiencing life, the influences, the things that they do in their spare time is just so radically different. And there's a really big difference between, engaging with university students and engaging with them. It seems like there's a really big divide, or sort of just difference in the culture, which makes it much harder, or at least you have to really be thinking through how you engage with them. So could you maybe give us some thoughts on that? What, driving that and best ways to engage? I know that's a huge question.
Yeah. No, you're fine. It's something that I've been processing on really. So I volunteer at our church youth group on a Wednesday night, and our conversation, how like after your youth group, you all sit down, you have a debrief of how the evening went. I think for the last year on and off, the constant conversation, even the difference between like year 9 to year 13 and year 7 to year 9 is huge. And we love our young people, but we have used terms like feral. Like it's just the difference between those younger age groups to the older ones is outrageous. And so to even get some of these, and I don't know whether this is just where I live, I don't think it is, because I've spoken to other youth workers and they've said the same thing, to even get them to sit and discuss a question that is a fairly standard question is completely wild. Like they just can't. And so even a standard, or these are our discussion questions for this Bible study, it just doesn't seem to hit in the way that it used to. And so we're having to start to try to be really quite creative in how you open young people up and begin to speak with them about topics and stuff, and getting them to listen and getting them to engage when they can't sit still. Another challenge that we've had, this was absolutely exceptional, is that I met with a young person a while ago that was in our small group, and essentially she asked to meet with me. But the reason she asked to meet with me is because she asked me if we couldn't do discussion questions anymore, and so I asked why that was. And she said, well, it's not really that I mind the questions. It's just that when you start to ask deep questions, I start to feel really anxious. And then I don't want to answer them because I'm really worried I'm going to have a panic attack. So could you just ask questions but not make us think about the answers? And I was like, well, that's not really how this works. Like, I don't feel like that's the solution to this situation. But even with this kind of idea of poor mental health, the fear of having an anxiety attack in amongst her peers, even to enter into a discussion question about things that are deep and meaningful was a really uncomfortable experience for her. And so it's, how you work with young people now and the things that do and don't work. And it will be different from youth group to youth group. But I think you really need to get to know your youth group to work out what the most effective way of doing youth work is, and spend some time trying to be a bit creative in that.
Yeah, I found that particularly striking as well, actually, because I have a teenager and I'm often saying, why don't you go outdoors? And it was quite interesting that the survey said that outdoors used to be the main way people socialize. But of course, for young people, as you say, it's totally different. What socializing is and what relationships are is totally different now.
Yeah.
I think one thing I thought that was very encouraging is the survey showed that beliefs in God, even spirits and ghosts and Christianity in general had all risen, each by about sort of over 10% or so. But you mentioned you linked some of that to changes that have happened in society. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about why you think there is this greater openness or warmth.
Yeah, do you know, the beauty of having a piece or like a report like this and having people talk about it is that you then hear some fascinating perspectives from much cleverer people than you. So when we launched this at the launch event, Rachel Gardner, you may or may not know her, she's exceptional. And one of the things that she observed, which was just a gem that I've sat on, is that she talked about how we've often looked at the younger generations, what we would possibly talk about as liberalism or open-mindedness, as a really negative thing, that they will opt into anything, that, you know, whether you're talking about gender or sexuality or, you know, whatever. But actually, they're just open-minded. And so I think that as the church, this has shown that they're just more open-minded to everything. And it's often, I think, I say it with trepidation, the church that is more closed-minded to young people than young people being open-minded to the church. The other fascinating thing, again, this was not my thought. This was the thought of a wonderful lady called Rachel Heffer at the EA. She was talking to me and she was talking about what she'd seen around young people going into church. And what's fascinating is that young people aren't just going into churches with loads of youth work. They're going into churches that maybe have no youth work. They're going into churches that you would consider to be very quiet, very traditional churches. And one of the interesting reflections that she fed back to me was that a lot of these young people that are highly anxious, what they're really enjoying is the ritual of these church services and the predictability. And so you go in and you know what you're going to get. It's calm. You know that this is the way it goes. You know that this is the layout. You know that this is the time that the service will finish. And actually that quiet space, full of peace, full of ritual and rhythm, almost is a comforting thing to a young person who's seeking out Jesus. And I thought that was really fascinating.
That is fascinating. I think I've read a few other things on, you know, how you engage Gen Alpha and how different that is. And so on the one hand, there's the idea that, okay, well, as the church, we want to be reaching people. And so it's, my leaning was to think, okay, well, you need to meet them on their terms, in terms of the way that they learn, the exposure to social media, and not just assume that, okay, well, here's the way we've done church. This is what happens in our Sunday programs. They need to sort of get on board with that. So that's on the one hand. But on the other, it seems what you're saying is there is actually something to the way that things have been done in terms of the richness, the spirituality, the predictability, even, given the mental health side of things. So that, I suppose, does make it somewhat tricky, depending on the context, right? So I don't know, could you share some more thoughts on that? If I'm sort of sitting with that, like confronting me, being like, okay, well, what is the best way then to be engaging them?
Yeah. So in terms of the church engaging with these guys, there were two big, I guess, takeaways for me as I've reflected on it. And the first of those goes back to what we were saying just now about how young people are coming to know Jesus. And so a lot of what we're seeing, and this is true of young adults as well, is, as I said, young people or young adults finding Jesus on their own and then turning up, or being like they've almost done a part of a spiritual journey without actually engaging with another Christian. Now, when I began talking about this with people, there was a really interesting reflection from a lady called Jo Frost, and she had said that this pattern is actually often what you see in a persecuted nation, the rhythm and pattern that people are finding Jesus and then coming to the church, rather than people going and telling someone about Jesus and then saying yes to Jesus. And as I was processing that, I wouldn't necessarily be as bold as to say God gave me the picture, but I had a picture of almost the church on one side of a bridge and young people on another, and Jesus recognizing that the church wasn't going to make it across to the bridge to the young people. And so almost Jesus beckoning those young people towards the church, and the church having a little less further to journey in order to interact with them. And so a part of this, I think, is a genuine almost grief in me, and a questioning of how did we as the church get to a point where Jesus had to do this without us with young people. So that there is that as a thing. Like, have we lost confidence not only in our own faith, but also in young people, to think that they would be warm or receptive to the things of Jesus? So that would be thing one. Thing two, I am a millennial, and so I will be candid about my opinion of millennials. I think that often, not always, often we as millennials, particularly British millennials, are really good at having a private faith and a private spirituality. So I will happily tell you that I'm a Christian, but I'm not necessarily good at wearing the spirituality of that on the outside. So whether that be engaging in things like healing or prophecy, or the things really that are, if you looked at the spiritual world, the idea of meditation, even, I mean, we look at sort of spiritual disciplines within this report as well. Disciplines of fasting, which really came out really high on this report. As a British millennial Christian, I haven't always been good at wearing my faith on the outside. And so I think there is something of a challenge to older Christians, particularly British Christians probably, to say, are you willing to put your faith on the outside? Because these young people are wearing their faith on the outside, but they're looking around and going, who else do I see doing this as a role model? Or who can I learn from, or learn to engage with Jesus in this way? And so I think we as the church maybe haven't been as forthcoming on a few fronts as perhaps we need to relearn to be.
Mm. Yeah, well, that's very interesting as well, because the survey also shows that many young people are having spiritual experiences.
Yeah.
And that was one of the striking things for me looking at that, especially if you think some of these people are, don't have church backgrounds. So that was one thing. The other one was just simply the things that young people are looking for. I mean, can you say anything about what they're looking for, and then perhaps how the church can meet that need, or should, how do we make sure we're aware of those things and can serve young people in what they are looking for in their search?
We've had some young people start coming on a Wednesday night. So we run a Friday night drop-in, and the young people who go to that drop-in are interesting. They are a little bit wild. You're not sure what they're going to get. They once were invited to come to church, and they said they'd come if they could come in their underwear. Like they just want to cause havoc. That is their main agenda. And so we've got this youth group on a Friday night that is a bit wild. And some of these guys started coming on a Wednesday night, which is much higher faith and spirituality content. And some of these young people are from very broken and vulnerable backgrounds. And we'll speak quite honestly about the fact that they come on a Wednesday night, not because they like the spiritual content necessarily, but because it's better than sitting in their room on their own at home. And there are people who want to talk with them, actual people who connect with them. And for some of them in that group of friends, there is some amazing spiritual stuff happening. So one of the guys, he was in my small group, I said, has anybody ever seen God do anything? And everyone kind of looked at each other and murmured. And then this one lad who's maybe been coming for 3 months, wouldn't say that he was a Christian, put his hand up and said, well, I was sick the other day and I prayed and God made me better straight away. And you're like, wow, this is incredible. So you've got that. But then so there's this sort of spiritual interest there and hunger, and a hunger that does something, like a spiritual interest that has a tangible outcome. This makes an actual difference to your life. This is who Jesus is and what he can do. But equally, there's this other girl who the spiritual stuff for her really isn't the one. Like she's a long way off that. But she turns up because she knows that there are actual adults who care about her, who will spend time with her, who will form genuine, deep relationship with her, and she will pitch up for those. And so I think when we're looking at what are young people looking for and what do they need, I think they're looking for authentic experience. And whether that is spiritual experience, relational experience, or a mix of the two, I think if you can be an adult who cares for and loves a young person and will journey alongside them, and you can be an adult that is brave enough to go, will you let me pray for you? How would you feel if I prayed that God would speak to me for you and we see what he might say, and find accessible ways to have those conversations with young people? I think that's the central thing. It's not about snazzy or jazzy. It's about sort of building authentic experience of something of depth and integrity.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you so much for sharing that. Sadly, I think we are at the end of our time. So one last question. Where can we find out more about the survey for someone who hasn't seen it? And what is next? Yes. I know that there's something else coming out very soon.
Yes, thank you so much. There is. So if you want to have a look at it, you can have a look at it for free online. If you go to yfc.co.uk/Z-A-growing-spirituality, or just put something of that nature into Google, you will find it and you can view it all online there. That is all there. By the time this comes out, we will have also put alongside that, it's almost like the second half of the conversation. So we've done a second piece of follow-up work where we have spoken to just under 260 churches around their views of young people and youth evangelism. And so you will ask questions, as we have here, where the young people, what do you think of the church in your community? We then ask the church, what do you think of the young people in your community? We've asked the young people, like, what's your greatest needs? And we've asked the church, what are your perceived greatest needs of young people? And so you've almost got the two sides of the conversation together. So that will be housed at that website as well. So it's worty.co.uk, growing spirituality, with lots of hyphens between all the letters and the words.
We will definitely link that in the show notes below. But again, thank you so much for the work that you've done on this. Thank you to YFC for just an amazing resource. I think if anyone has the question of whether, is there really something going on spiritually with, the Gen Alpha, Gen Z, I think unequivocally, yes, something is happening, and it's an amazing time to be able to engage. What an opportunity to share the hope of Jesus Christ. But this is, again, just a big thank you for joining us on the show. And until next time, in our next Pep Talk podcast, we will see you then.